My name is Emily Van Deventer, and I'm the head of the Radiation and Health Unit at the World Health Organization. I will co-chair this session with Dr. Kun-Woo Cho, and we will have 5 presentations this morning. So I would like to welcome Dr. Cho as the first speaker, and let me just give a couple words about him. He is a principal researcher at the Korea Institute of Nuclear Safety. He's also currently a member of the ICRP Main Commission. And before he joined the Main Commission, he was a member of Committee 4 and chaired the Task Group 94, which actually produced the draft report for the ICRP publication 138, very relevant to this session, on ethical foundations of the system of radiological protection. Dr. Cho, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emily, and good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the second day of the symposium. My name is Kun-Woo Cho, and I am very pleased to have this opportunity to introduce what is the ethical foundations of the radiological protection system. In October 2013, about 9 years ago, when I first joined the ICRP as a C4 member, ICRP Task Group 94 started its work with the mandate of developing an ICRP publication which elicits and makes clear what are the ethical values underlying the radiological protection system. Then, the draft prepared by the TG94 was published as ICRP Publication 138 in 2018 after the review and approval of the Main Commission. Publication 138 is the first ICRP publication dedicated to elaborating the ethical foundations of the radiological protection system, and this publication is intended to be used to assist in discussions related to the practical implementation of the system by providing an insight into applying the system where there are competing ethical priorities. The main part of publication 138 is to identify and explain what are the 4 core ethical values underpinning the current system of radiological protection. Namely, they are beneficence, non-maleficence, prudence, justice, and dignity. If I may elaborate each of these 4 core ethical values, then I can tell first that beneficence means promoting or doing good, and non-maleficence means avoiding causation of harm. These values of beneficence and non-maleficence are reflected, for example, in the primary aim of the system. Beneficence and non-maleficence are directly related to the aim of preventing or reducing harmful effects for humans and environment. Aspects to consider under beneficence would include the direct health benefits of radiation exposure in medical sector, as well as the societal benefits of the various practices associated with radiation exposure in non-medical sectors. At the same time, in the system of radiological protection, we know it is inevitable to recognize that actions resulting in radiation exposure could have the potential to cause harm. Prudence is a form of wisdom about practical methods and actions, and is the ability to make informed and carefully considered choices without full knowledge of the scope and consequences of an action. The value of prudence is the cornerstone of the system of radiological protection, which is incorporated as LNT model and ALARA principle. It allows to take into account the inevitable uncertainties of radiation science and to act judiciously and reasonably. Prudence is related to uncertainty at low-dose exposure especially, and if there is no clear evidence, deliberation is needed with stakeholder involvement. Next value, justice, is usually defined in three different ways, namely distributive justice, restorative justice, and procedural justice. Justice is also the fairness in the distribution of advantages and disadvantages. Justice is a key value underlying, for example, individual dose restrictions that aim to prevent any individual from receiving an unfair burden of risk. In the scientific context of radiological protection, a value of equity related to justice was first introduced in generating the idea of dose constraints for an individual. The idea of dose constraints is to optimize radiation dose in the range of tolerable risk for each individual. So these dose constraints would be considered as one of the instruments to achieve equity and justice in some planned exposure situations. Dignity is an attribute of the human condition. Dignity is the unconditional respect that every person deserves, irrespective of personal attributes or circumstances. Human dignity is closely related to the ethical value of autonomy, which is defined as the capacity to choose freely for oneself and be able to direct one's own life. Respect for human dignity and autonomy is considered central to free informed consent. In radiological protection, recognition of individual rights are commonly associated with those limits, namely to protect the rights of the individual not to be exposed to an excessive level of harm, irrespective of the consequences for society. But the values of dignity and autonomy are relevant to far more than those limitations. Issues cover the importance of worker and patient consent, as well as the involvement of stakeholders in a variety of decisions related to radiological protection. Together with the four core ethical values, Publication 138 has also identified the procedural values that are about the practical implementation of the recommendations based on a number of requirements relating to the procedural and organizational aspects of radiological protection. Accountability can be defined as the procedural ethical value that people who are in charge of decision-making must answer for their actions to all those who are likely to be affected by these actions. Accountability is also a part of implementing the value of intergenerational distributive justice. Transparency is also part of implementing the value of procedural justice. Transparency relates to the accessibility of information about the activities, deliberations, and decisions at stake, and also the clarity, practicality, and honesty with which this information is transmitted. The value of inclusiveness is usually referred to using the phrase stakeholder participation. Stakeholder participation, also referred to as stakeholder involvement or stakeholder engagement, means involving all relevant parties in the decision-making processes related to radiological protection. Publication 138 also tries to explain what is the relationship between the core ethical values and the three fundamental principles of radiological protection. The four core ethical values permeate the current system of radiological protection through many years of the evolution of the system, but their relationship with the three principles is not quite straightforward. This is not so much the case for justification, which can be understood as mainly referring to beneficence and the maleficence, or rather the balancing of doing good and avoiding harm. But when it comes to optimization and those limitations, we have to admit that these principles depend upon several of the core ethical values. and the two key concepts of reasonableness and tolerability, which are central to the principles of optimization and dose limitation, respectively, specify how the radiation risk is managed by combining and balancing the core ethical values. We know that the system of radiological protection is based on three pillars, namely science and ethics and experience. The publication 138 portrays the system as relying on four core ethical values, and it highlights that ethics can certainly provide useful insights on the principles and philosophies of radiological protection, and thus help the dialogue between radiological protection professionals and other stakeholders. What is next step forward for the implementation of Publication 138 in day-to-day basis practices? In order to find an answer to this question, ICRP has launched two task groups. They are TG109 on ethics in radiological protection for medical diagnosis and treatment, and TG114 on reasonableness and tolerability in the system of radiological protection. These two TGs are discussing the issue of practical implementation of the ethical values in various daily basis practices of radiological protection. And you are about to hear the current status of the progress of work that has been made so far by these two TGs in the following presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wu. We now will go to the next presentation by Dr. Thierry Schneider. And I hope the slides will come up. Yeah. So just a couple words about Thierry. I don't think he needs much introduction, but still. Thierry is the director of the Nuclear Protection Evaluation Center in France, and has been involved in a number of research projects related to the assessment and management of the radiological risk, including the social and the ethical issues. He's currently the chair of Committee 4, and is also the chair of the Committee on Radiological Protection and Public Health of NEA OECD. Thierry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emily, for this introduction, and good morning, everybody. So my talk has already been introduced by the presentation of Kun-Wo Cho, and I will emphasize the current work. This is not the final reflection, but some element with regard to reasonableness and tolerability following the discussion that occur during the preparation of the publication 138. So first of all, what we mean by tolerability and reasonableness and in radiation protection, this is interesting to come back to the first publication, publication 1 of ICRP, not the first recommendation from ICRP, but the first publication in 1959. And then you can find that tolerability and reasonableness are already were already on the agenda. The first sentence refers to the definition of the value that we can consider acceptable or unacceptable, and you see that the first element is to limit the radiation dose to that which involves a risk that is not unacceptable. And this is interesting to notice that it's not only at the individual level, but also to the population at large. So we already have some consideration on tolerability, on encapsulating the collective aspect. And the second part, another paragraph in 45 in this publication, it's not only to limit the risk, but we also need to keep the risk as low as practicable. So of course, then you have the evolution from practicable to reasonably achievable, and then the question is what we put behind this element and how to evaluate the reasonableness and the tolerability. You know that there is ongoing discussion at national and international level, and ICRP published several documents on that. NEA also published some elements. IEA also discussed these elements. So there are a large number of discussions on this concept, and based on that, it was decided in 2019 to set up a dedicated task group just after the publication 138 to make more detail about what we mean by reasonableness and tolerability, and to prepare some material which could be useful for the development of the future recommendation. So, first of all, the definition which have been introduced in publication 138 on ethical issue and the link with tolerability and reasonableness. Roughly speaking, tolerability is defined as the degree or extent to which something can be endured. So then, we will have to think about what does it mean and who can endure. Is it at the individual level? It will depend on the exposure situation. So you may have a large number of discussion behind this first definition. And when we go further with reasonableness, this is to make rational, informed, and impartial decisions that respect other views, goals, and conflicting interests. So we balance different aspects with regard to rationality, and also some element in terms of embarking the different ethical consideration, social and economic consideration. Then if we check the general aim of protection and the relationship with the core ethical value, publication 138 emphasized that the objective is to do more good than harm, to avoid unnecessary risk, establish a fair distribution of exposure, and treat people with respect. And in this pursuit, the two concepts of reasonableness and tolerability, although supported by quantitative methods, definitively remain a matter of deliberative process. So this is this element that we try to explore in this task group. You may have in mind that the first model of tolerability of risk was introduced in publication 60 in the 90s, largely based on the work performed by the UK Health and Safety Executive. And then we reached to a model where you had some differentiation between unacceptable, tolerable, and acceptable or negligible risk. Today, we are more in the process of considering tolerability and tolerable and not tolerable. The key difficulty is the fact that we discussed several times, mentioning that the tolerability is not only a matter of individual risk. But then in this graphic, we are coming back to the level of individual exposure, and we have difficulty to really represent within a graphic all the different components. And so it's why the discussion currently with the task group is to consider that we have no universal value of radiological risk criterion between tolerability and not tolerability. And then there is a need to have more flexibility and to embark other components. I will come back briefly on that. And the other point I will give more detail as well is to consider that the problem of reasonableness, it's not only to define within the tolerability of risk which risk could be reasonable, it's much more broader than that, and then you need to have different aspects and to discuss what is behind the R of reasonableness, and we suggested to have some element on relationship, rational, and resources. So the framework of tolerability of risk, we try to encapsulate some key points, which is not the final definition, but we try to push a little bit what we could define as tolerability. First of all, this is individual and societal level of risk, and then with regard to that, all the discussion on the construction of the radiation detriment will influence this definition. There is also a qualitative judgment depending on various components and the specific exposure situation and context. And clearly, the discussion on tolerability when you are in emergency or post-accident situation will be significantly different than for planned exposure situation, for example, in the nuclear sector or in the medical sector. Reasonableness refers to good judgment, fairness, practicability, but we also mention some element of moderateness, appropriateness. And of course, the key point for reasonableness is the stakeholder involvement and the optimization as a deliberative process to achieve a reasonable compromise with all, or as much as possible, all informed stakeholders. Then with regard to the radiological criteria, we may have in mind those limits, those constraints, or reference level. They play a dual role in the implementation of the radiological protection system. First of all, they contribute to reduce inequities when we consider the ethical aspect, inequities in the distribution of individual exposure. They also refer to justice in this perspective and to have, due to the wide distribution of individual exposure, notably when we have in mind the existing exposure situation where we may be confronted to a large spectrum of individual exposure. It's also ensure that exposure are below the value considered as not tolerable. And of course, then we refer to non-maleficence and to take into account prudence, justice, as well as dignity. It depends on exposure situation, as it was mentioned. Then, of course, the benchmark with existing risk could be interesting to consider to inform the processes. But it's also some restriction of individual exposure with possible control. And it's also the border, the fact that there is no, unfortunately, there is no magic number and there is no universal value. And even for tolerability, you will have to embark the different specific situations. With regard to social consideration in reasonableness, this is interesting to come back to publication 101 in 2006, where you already had a series of key components, which were equity, sustainability, international consideration, individual benefit and social benefit. And one point which is quite important is the question of social trust. And then when we publish the first result of the TG on reasonableness, we try to embark these different elements, and you see behind the 3R, you have stakeholder empathy, trust, you have technical, contextual, and ethical issue, technological, financial, and the time. So the key element is how to combine all these aspects in order to have a deliberative process to evaluate the different components. Then, in conclusion, there is a need to further discuss in different exposure situations, and the ethical value will play a significant role. For example, when we discuss the selection of radiological criteria in post-accident situation, what does it mean, how far to go, and the decision is not only to say that 1 millisievert or few millisievert is reasonable. You need to really embark a different component and consider significantly ethical aspect. There is the same situation when we have to allocate protection resources in planned exposure situation, notably in the nuclear sector, taking into account the possible transfer of risk between public and occupational exposure. And then it could be also a way to identify priorities in emergency situation, notably to protect specific vulnerable population or so on. The challenge now for elaborating practical guidance is really to see in which way we can propose something where we will be able, within the to discuss tolerability of risk and reasonableness, adapted to each exposure situation. And so we will have no magic situation, but we will try to propose some different elements, and we are currently working on medical exposure, on protection of the environment, and other situations. So I think I've already over time for what was planned initially. So I just would like to thank all the members of the task group, and we will be able to continue the work and interact with all the people interested with this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schneider. The next presentation is by Professor François Bauchu, who is the director of the Institute of Radiation Physics at the Lausanne University Hospital and the Lausanne University in Switzerland. Professor Bauchu is a Swiss medical physicist and also a recognized expert in dosimetry, and as such, he's a member of the ICRU and also the chair of ICRP Committee 2. François.
Okay. Thank you, Emily, and hello, everybody. So I will present what Kun-Woo Cho already initiated. He said that we will be more practical after publication 138, and hopefully TG 109 will manage to present you something that is more practical and that deals with ethical radiation protection in the domain of medical diagnostic and treatment. I would like just to make a list of the specialties or the expertise of the members of the task groups. So you can see that we obviously have some people who know about ethics, that was really important, but we also had people that were really in the field who know what medicine is, and there were maybe too many, I don't know, maybe, well, there are a lot of physicists. Like Werner Röhm likes to say, well, he's a bit cynical when he says this, physicists know everything. Actually, we had to realize that we didn't know everything. So that was also a good thing for us to know a bit more this domain of ethics. But anyway, the goal was to be practical. What is the mandate of our group, of our task group? Well, it's to develop an ICRP publication that presents the ethical aspects in the use of radiation in medicine. So we have to build on publication 138 that was just presented by Kun-Woo before. And actually, we had first to recognize that we are just young in ethics. Obviously, in publication 138, we could retrospectively explain that we were dealing with ethics since the birth of Jesus Christ, sure. But in practice, we explicited this only in 2018. So it's relatively recent, especially when we compare with what was done in medicine. In medicine, clearly, it was not since Jesus Christ, it was even before Jesus Christ that they were doing ethics. So I think it is important to realize this. And therefore, if we want to write a recommendation about the use of ethics in medicine, clearly we have to take into account of what is already here. When we cannot just arrive with and saying, we have a good news for you, we know what ethics is. They knew what it is, so we had to take this into account. But anyway, we have something to bring, something new to bring, and in this report that we are going to publish or to put to public consultation, we can show that we have some specificities. So the first purpose of this report is to bridge the gap between two communities, the medical communities and us, the RP community. We want actually to be practical, as I said. And in order to be practical, we arrived to the conclusion that we should propose an evaluation method that can be used in practice by the practitioners, either as a training when we have, for instance, a situation that we guess could happen, or if we have practical situation that we want to analyze from an ethical point of view. That's what we want to propose. And again, in order to be practical, we described several scenarios that are more or less common depending on the countries, but we try to have examples that come from different areas of the world, from different application of radiation in medicine, and at the end, we ended up with 11 scenarios in imaging, 10 in therapy. And obviously, As I said before, the physicists who were in the task group had to learn a lot. We were really conscious that we needed to emphasize education and training for the people who wants to know a bit more about ethics in radiation protection. Okay, so as I said, we arrived in a place where ethics is known. In biomedical ethics, they have this principle. Actually, they have principles in biomedical ethics. And for us, in radiation protection, principles are reserved for justification, optimization, limitation. So, well, that was the first thing we had to adjust in our to have a common language. But you can see that the 4 principles of biomedical ethics are similar to the ones Conwood just presented for radiation protection. It's not by chance, though, obviously. But in medicine or biomedical ethics, they also have other principles that are becoming more and more important. Solidarity, precaution, empathy, honesty. So these are things that are really more and more present in medicine. And in parallel, on our side, radiological protection, you have the values, well, not principle, but the values that Conwood just presented. And we also have other values, inclusiveness, accountability, and transparency. Well, when we were in front of all this, we thought, first of all, we need to tidy up these different values and principles in order to have something that makes sense. And therefore, well, it was not that difficult. For the 2 first one, you can see they are exactly the same names, so it was easy to put them together. For justice, we thought that solidarity was really something that was similar to justice or was included in justice. And if we wanted to add this value, it was quite easy to put it with justice. Justice is being the sustainable use of the means that we have, so it is clearly linked to justice. Dignity and autonomy, Conwood said that they were really linked already in publication 138. In medicine, the word autonomy is really important. In radiation protection, we thought that dignity was maybe more important, but when we look at it, we realize that autonomy is some kind of corollary of dignity, so clearly they go together. For the next one, prudence and precaution, well, at first glance, they look very similar. Prudence, I think Conwood explained that just before. Prudence is clearly not what your mom told you when you were a kid. Be prudent, honey. No, that's not what prudence is. If you read the text of Conwood, you realize that prudence was the way to take into account uncertainty when we have to make a decision. It's not to take the less risky solution. Okay. And precaution is more the application of the reflection made under prudence. And inclusiveness and empathy, clearly that goes together. In medicine, empathy is more and more important. And finally, we had a problem because we wanted to have 2 for each. But we had, at the end, it was a hard negotiation within the task group. We put 3 values together, but they are really linked. I'm sure you can see this quite easily. Anyway, I will not present all the details of the task group, but I think it was important to give you some example, well, how the evaluation method was done. So we have the core values here. We have the procedural values that are in publication 138, and all these values, as you just saw, they are now linked with what is done in medicine. And the method that we propose is that, okay, we have a situation, a scenario, or real situation that we have in the hospital, or a procedure that we want to initiate in the hospital, and we want to analyze it from an ethical point of view. So what we will do is to go value by value and analyze the compliance of the scenario or the situation we have in front of us. And if there is some compliance, we put 1 smiley. And if the compliance is very good, then we put 2 smiley. And, well, or if there is nothing to mention, we put this, but that's not important. But the world is not simple, as we all know. So sometimes you can have a situation in which there is some compliance or even some good compliance for 1 value, but when we look really broadly and we try to be honest, we can see that the same situation also has some aspect that do not comply with the same value, or that really do not comply with the same value. So therefore, we can have two approaches from both sides. And we do this for all the values that we have, and then we have an analysis of the situation. So in practice, in the report, you will have a series of scenarios. I told you there will be 21 scenarios, and each scenario will be presented in one page. So a third of a page will describe the scenario, more or less a third of the page will be a table of compliance that I just presented, and the final third of each page will explain why the task group gave a certain amount of smiley or frownies for the different values. This will be just obviously an opinion of the task group. Some other people may have other evaluation, but well, that gives an example. And as I said, 21 scenarios, 11 in imaging, 10 in therapy, and we have a large amount of panel. We try to cover as many situations as possible. And in summary, what can I say? Well, I can say that this report should help medical and RP professionals to have a common language and to interact and take into account the ethical values. I said also that the report proposed a method to review the practice. It's centered on the ethical values, that's clear. It should help to analyze the situation, maybe to find a solution under an ethical dilemma. It is important with this method, what we have is a view from a situation from different perspectives, so we have different perspective. We also realized that, as I said, for us poor physicists, that it required to make our brain work a bit differently. So in this report, there is, I think, a strong theoretical basis or explanation of what is ethics. So I didn't show you this today because you will need to concentrate and read these parts. And this should bring a good theoretical basis for all of us. And we also tried actually to take the perspective of the practitioner and the perspective of the radiological protection expert. So that means that we have a chapter in which we explain what is important for a radiological protection expert to understand in medicine, and for somebody who knows not much about radiation protection, what should they know in order to see the link with the ethical values. And in order to help the readers, we changed slightly the format of the ICRP publication, and we have several key messages all along the text, so that could help the readers. So you will find a key message somewhere, and if you want to have more details, you will find the explanation very close to this key message. So we put a lot of effort to help the reader. And this draft report will be available in a few weeks for public consultation, and I hope that you will enjoy this reading and give us some good feedbacks. We already had some external feedbacks before we'll be able to put it into public consultation, but we'll be happy to have as many comments as possible. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Francois. Our next speaker is Mr. Frido Sulzer. He is the professor of environmental science at the University of South Bohemia in Budapest, Czech Republic. At the University of South Bohemia since 2005, his research has focused on chromosomal damage induced by radon exposure and on ethics of radiological protection. He was member of ICRP TG 94, and he is currently a member of Committee 4, and also he is a member of TG 109 that was just presented by our colleague Francois. So please. Yeah.
Thank you, Conwu, and thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak about one of my favorite topics. I mean, radon is also a favorite topic, but ethics is maybe even more. I should start maybe with a disclaimer. There is task group on the environment, task group 105, considering the environment when applying the system of radiological protection. But I'm not a representative and even a member of that task group. So I took the liberty here to present, I will try to present my humble attempts to come to terms with the different values that have been brought up and how they relate to each other. Kunwu has introduced the core values and the procedural values. You see here that I like to think of them in terms of being somehow correlated. So if you want to be prudent, if you want to think of things that could happen, but you don't know exactly what will happen, then this is a sign of accountability, or the practical value that the procedural value that you put in practice here is accountability. When you think of procedural justice in particular, but maybe also in distributional justice, you have to be transparent. Fair process can only be achieved when you have transparency. And if you respect the dignity of people, then you include them in your decision making. You don't make decisions for them. Now, ICRP 138 is certainly the first publication to be dedicated to ethics, but it's not the first publication to have addressed ethical questions. ICRP 91 in 2003 was about the impact of ionizing radiation on non-human species. So it didn't mention in the title, at least, the environment, but non-human species. And there is this list of 6 values or principles: sustainable development, conservation, preservation, maintenance of biodiversity, environmental justice, and human dignity. And I hope you will agree that this is a bit of a mixed bag, because it's not all relating to non-human species, but some of the values are clearly related to humans. So, for instance, environmental justice is used to express the need for fair process for different groups within our population, especially a look at the sometimes unfair exposure of certain vulnerable and marginalized communities. So justice not towards the environment, but justice to the groups that are exposed to environmental factors, so a human value. And human dignity, obviously, human dignity, it presumes non-discrimination, which is very much related to environmental justice, but also, as we have heard before, it is about the respect for people's autonomous decision-making. So again, it's not something that is directly related to non-human species or the environment as such. So we have here a mix of things, and we have to, I think we have to better differentiate between the two areas. The remaining 4 values really relate to environmental issues. So there's conservation, which in the words of that report relates to the importance of vulnerability attached to individual species and the areas in which they live, so the habitats. Then there's maintenance of biodiversity, which is not very much discussed in the report as an ethical principle, and I think it can be brought down to precaution, because maintenance of biodiversity is very much about the significance which the variety of species and habitats has for the system as a whole, for the ecosystem as a whole. And this is pretty much unknown in many cases. So to maintain biodiversity, although you don't know exactly what the role of this diversity is a question of precaution. Sustainable development addresses the obligation to protect and provide for both the human and environmental needs of present and future generations. And you find that in the literature very often as intergenerational equity. So it's, in my view, it's mainly a question of justice, although of course it has also some relationship with prudence. Then there is the word preservation, which, as far as I know, is not always and commonly used in the sense that it is presented here, but it is important. It recognizes the worth of nature as pristine, as independent of human needs, but also as an important cultural value, promoting character and spirituality. That's more or less the words, a bit shortened of the report. We could say that, as I said, preservation in the literature is not always used in this way, but what is more common in the literature, I think, is reverence for nature, or reverence for life, but I would like to broaden it a bit to reverence for nature. So if we try to now correlate these environmental values with the core values of ICRP 138, we see, of course, that conservation is beneficence and non-maleficence to nature. So you want to do good to natural systems, ecosystems, or non-human species, and you don't want to harm them. Prudence, as in the case of medicine, takes a more specific expression in precaution, especially precaution with respect to the complexity of natural systems. Then, as I said, justice, I think, finds expression here in the environmental field more as sustainability, because it's very much about the justice towards those that are coming after us, and dignity, okay, human dignity towards humans, but reverence for nature in general, for the non-human systems. And then if we again pair procedural values, of course, we still speak about accountability, there's no question about that. Of course, we still speak about transparency. We have to leave to the coming generations, for instance, transparent information about what we are doing, where we have dumped our waste, and so on. And then the problem, of course, with inclusiveness, that is the third procedural value in ICRP 138. How are you going to do that? How are you including the non-human species or nature as such in your decision-making? And there, I think, we have to use another term, or have to think in other terms. And in the environmental discussion, what is very widespread, what is very common, is the term stewardship. So we are taking care of those non-human species or the ecosystems because, well, we have the capacity to think about consequences and about protection, and we have to do that for our clients in the non-human realm. Something that I find very interesting and important for ICRP is to look at how much these values are really based on the traditions or on the thinking in different cultures. I mean, we have an International Commission on Radiological Protection. Werner Rühm yesterday showed us how geographically widespread the membership of the ICRP family is, and we are not doing too badly, but on the other hand, if you look at the numbers, there's still a very much, a very huge, how do you say, majority of the members of our family are from Northern America and Europe, and maybe Japan, Korea, but the rest of the world is not so well represented. But I think ICRP should more and more make an effort to at least include in their thinking ideas or ways of thinking from other cultures. So I have put here together, I can't read all of that, I don't have time, actually time is running out, that these ideas are have a backing in different cultures. The term reverence for nature comes from a Christian background. Albert Schweitzer, a French-German philosopher, came up with this term reverence for life, but we could broaden it to reverence for nature. We find similar things in the indigenous traditions. We find that in, for instance, Buddhist scriptures, or if we don't go to religious documents, in the Earth Charter of the year 2000, respect Earth and life in all its diversity, recognize that every form of life has value regardless of its worth to human beings. And that's something that is contained in this word preservation. And if I can just briefly make a detour here, we have a task group working on ecosystem services, and certainly ecosystem service is a very useful concept and should be pursued by ICRP, but ecosystem services have also its limitations. It's still very quite anthropocentric, because it is services that nature provides for humans, and there is an inclusion of cultural services, for instance, spiritual values, yes, but it's not taking nature as something that is, has value in itself and regardless of its worth to human beings. I also put together something about stewardship, too much to go into details here. What I would like to conclude with is that these principles, of course, have prima facie validity. So if you look at the principles, they all seem to be valid if you look at each and every one of them. But sometimes they are in conflict with each other. You can have situations where you can't have all of it. You can't have all 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 values at the same time. They are not always compatible. And they are not even commensurable. So you cannot even say, how do we measure these values in order to compare them? How do you compare reverence for nature on the one hand and beneficence to humans on the other hand, or prudence in economic values, for instance? Of course, ICRP for some time has promoted a cost-benefit analysis, but has gone away from it very much by saying not that it's bad, but it's very limited in its scope. We have to use other qualitative methods. Maybe this ecosystem services approach is one, but we can't measure everything, and therefore, because we don't have a measuring stick, we can't compare easily what is more important in a particular situation, one or the other principle. And therefore, I think the only way out is public discourse. It has been mentioned a couple of times that these things have to be discussed, these things have to be valued in different societies, maybe even not especially around the world by a cross-cultural discourse. And I put here, again, I don't have time, put here a couple of quotes from different religious traditions or philosophical traditions, that discourse is really something that we should look at. Just take the third quote, which is from Japan. The first Buddhist regent of Japan said, "When big things are at stake, the danger of error is great. Therefore, many should discuss and clarify the matter together so the correct way may be found." So maybe it has not been always implemented in all cultural contexts that we should sit together and consult, but it is there. We can point at traditions in different areas of the world which encourage consultation. So my conclusions: the relationship between the environmental values listed in ICRP 91 and the general values identified in ICRP 138 need further clarification. I have presented you my take on it, but it may be, you may see it differently, and the group may see it differently. Questions of environmental health, which is the effects of radiation on human health and well-being, and environmental integrity, which is the effect of radiation on non-human species and whole ecosystems, should be distinguished. We should really look at what clientele we are speaking about, humans or non-humans. And finally, public discourse, especially discourse across cultural borders is needed for a balanced approach to radiological protection of the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frido. Thank you, Frido. Our next speaker is Dr. Sandor Dimitar. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba. He is a physician in nuclear medicine and public health. He served 2 terms with the ICRP at Committee 3. He is currently a member of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, CNSC, and an expert review panel member of the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, CADTH. His talk is on applying a public health ethics framework to radiation protection. So, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and just for the record, my speech is being given with my academic hat on as a university professor. So I'm going to talk about public health ethics and a framework to radiation protection. And I'm not going to read, one of the benefits of speaking last is I don't have to, a lot of things have been discussed, so I can get through them to my main point, and somehow my slides are advancing on their own. So I'll speak to the slide that I had. So why do we need an ethical framework for nuclear industries? And one of the textbooks that I quoted says for 3 reasons. One is long-lived isotopes for millennia, the catastrophic effect of potential mishaps, and the dual nature of activities between civilian and military use. And the issue with ethics is one lens that a policymaker uses to make decisions, as you can see. And I'm not sure why the slides are advancing, but that's okay. So we've talked about all of these before, and I want to say that equality and equity are very different things, and this tells a very good illustration of that, where the equity is more of a distributive justice lens versus equality. So the previous slide talked about the medical model, the underpinnings of the CNSC, or the ICRP for optimization, justice, and dose, and then the ethical model that was being developed. And one of the things you can see with that, because we've discussed all those elements before, is that they're building on going from individuals to groups, and I'm going to talk about populations. Okay, so there are public health ethics guidelines that have been preset, and of course during COVID they became very important, and I'll talk about the model that's in the book on the left, the public health ethics. And this is from the EPA Protective Action Guide, and this is the scenario. You have a nuclear power plant, it has an emission that's unplanned, you have areas that people are relocated, evacuated, and shelter in place, and those decisions are made at a population level. And what ethical model do you use to make those decisions? And you should actually think about that pre-hoc before you get into that scenario. So this is the key slide for my talk. What is the ethical framework for public health? And these are the 4 principles. The Mills harm principle says that you should never do something to an individual. You use the least amount of coercive actions possible to derive the benefit you're trying to achieve. And so the example I use here is in my own city. There was a patient we treated for hyperthyroidism, gave him a radioactive thyroid dose. They discharged themselves against medical advice, went off to a motel, hotel kind of thing, had a party. And how do you deal with the ethics of managing the individual and the risks to others? And you know, it became a real difficult decision between public health and the Public Health Act and police. So those are kind of things that, that may raise the harm principle as to how far can you coerce someone and using the least amount of coercive powers that you have. And if you're evacuating, relocating, or sheltering in place individuals, you should know ahead of time how are you going to deal with people that say, I don't want to move, I don't want to leave. That should be ahead of time. Transparency is phenomenally important. So when we're talking about deep geological repositories in Canada, we need a phenomenal amount of transparency, and Bob McDonald said before, explaining what we're doing, explaining what the risk is, having a tactile understanding of those individuals who are listening to you, what you're talking about. And I think if you look at Netflix, the 3 Mile Island documentary, which had phenomenally little radiation released, The big problem with that whole issue was transparency and communication and getting mixed messages. So using least coercive means possible, we talked about that through the harm principle. You're staging your actions based, it's like a regulator will start with, you know, talking and incidents and moving up to monetary penalties down the road. So there's a progression of coercive means to get the sort of compliance that you're looking for. And the last one's quite interesting. If you're going to get people en masse to move, relocate, shelter in place, you need to give them the resources they need to do that. So if you're going to relocate, you have to find places for them to relocate. If you're going to evacuate, you need evacuation centers. So you're talking about the same kind of infrastructure you have for natural disasters, whether it's tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes. You need that sort of infrastructure in there to deal with allowing people. If you're going to tell people to do something en masse, you have to provide the resources. So this is the ethical framework that's used in public health. And I think the bridge here is between the evolution of what's happening with the ICRP and their ethical principles for radiation protection and applying it to a population. And what I'm suggesting is that this framework may be a component of that bigger picture of how do you deal with populations. And in the most recent release by the ICRP on environmental consequences of untoward nuclear incidents, this kind of framework may be quite useful for how you deal with a population around a nuclear incident versus dealing with individuals. It's hard to deal with what competes between the autonomy of an individual as an ethical principle and the sort of utilitarian benefit to society. And you have to sort of think about that before the incident because you're going to have to deal with it during the incident. So that's my talk in the rapid first sequence of slides. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. And now I would like to open to questions from the floor. So there are microphones in each of the aisles, so please feel free to use them. Thank you.
Thomas Otto from the ICRU. Mr. Schneider, if you do away with the middle band in the tolerability of risk framework, where we normally have acceptable, optimizable, and not acceptable, where do you put optimization when you directly border the non-acceptable with the tolerable?
Yes, thank you. It's okay. Thank you for the question. I had no time to go in detail. In fact, the optimization is put with reasonableness, and then the first element is to discuss what is tolerable or not tolerable. Depending on the exposure situation, the optimization process could start above the border of not tolerable for some few elements. And we have in mind, for example, for emergency situation, we will discuss optimization, taking into account that some people, some responder may have exposure above the tolerability which could be considered in a broader sense with specific circumstances. But in fact, in most of the case, of course, we will be below in the border of tolerability where we will have this process of optimization. So it's why currently the graphic is too tricky and we are confronted to the situation that we want to embark so many components that is difficult to put in a single graphic. But if some of you have some proposal, they are more than welcome.
Thank you. Analia?
Yes, hello. Thierry, please. Oh, it's okay?
Closer.
Yeah.
Yes. If you can clarify how the TG is thinking about the tolerability of risk for existing exposure situations, because between tolerable and not tolerable, they have to define a risk, radiological risk criteria. This is very easy, I think, more easier for plant exposure situation with the dose limits. But what happens when we have reference levels? So how to explain the tolerability of risk? How are you trying to, the model to define the link with the reference levels that you can have a range, not a value like the dose limits? Because I think this is very important then to transmit to stakeholders, to communicate when they have to select a reference level, that why this is tolerable when you have a range. If you can explain a little more which is the development or what are you thinking, discussing in the task group. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a difficulty that we have when we come back to the model which was proposed in publication 60. In fact, the tolerability was defined the border of limit, the dose limit represents the tolerability. Then that was not so easy because you have limit for workers, you have limit for the public. So even at that stage, that was not so simple to explain. Nowadays, when we embark a different type of exposure situation, we are no more able to discuss only the limit. And then when we go a step further, we say that finally the level of tolerability is not characterized only by a level of risk, and then you have no universal level of risk which could be considered as tolerable or not tolerable. And then you have also to embark some component on characterization of the situation. If you have only one individual concern, or if you have you embark a group of population and so on, you have to consider the dynamics, what could be the possible evolution of the situation. So you need to embark different components, and it's why finally we put a range of value for the radiological criteria, which may generate frustration because, of course, for the implementation, it would be easier to have only one value. But in reality, and when we check the literature in different domains and what have been presented yesterday by Gillian Hurt in the oil, in the petroleum, offshore petroleum situation, this is some similarity. You have to engage a debate, and you have to inform the processes to select the criteria, but there is no, unfortunately, there is no magic value or universal value. You may have some indication, and the benchmark and the comparison with other situations may be useful, but this is not enough to define the tolerability of risk.
Thank you. Please.
Yes, thank you. I just want to make a remark on physicists. Being myself a physicist, when I studied physics at the university, I got the impression that a lot of physicists really tended to believe that they know everything. So chemistry is just quantum mechanics, cosmology is physics, you know. And I was really proud to be part of this smart community. But when I left this bubble, I immediately understood that the real world works a bit differently. It's more complicated. And the best example is RP, radiological protection. I mean, a physicist alone cannot do RP. A biologist alone as well, a physician, and ethicists even cannot do RP alone. We all have to work together. And this is the beauty, actually. At least this is my personal view. This is the beauty, that all the disciplines have to work together to make radiological protection successful. It was just a remark to clarify this. Thank you.
Thank you, please.
Hi, I'm a radiotherapy physicist. I have a question for Francois about the ethics. So I was wondering if you're including any discussion or examples about integrating ethic principles for the development of imaging policies, for the use of radiologic imaging, for patient positioning or online treatment adaptation in radiotherapy.
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question a bit slower? Because,
I'm sorry, yes. So I was wondering if you are including any discussion or examples about integrating some the ethics principles for the development of imaging policies for patient positioning or adaptation for radiotherapy with the use of radiologic imaging. I know with TG116 we're trying to optimize imaging dose for radiotherapy, but I know that in the clinic when we develop imaging policies, we don't think about ethical principles, we just think about procedural. So I was wondering if you were discussing that.
Yes, the method that we propose can be applied for a wide range of situations, and the development of, for instance, of a policy within a hospital to decide how to deal with a woman professional who becomes pregnant, for instance. Before things happen, this method can be used clearly. We gave a range of examples in the draft report, but we didn't touch everything, that's sure, but the method could be applied for many different aspects.
Excellent. I look forward to see the draft. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Toif Samuel Mabat from Mozambique. I would like to thanks for a great work that the ICRP are still doing. And I have a question, but I don't know that it's a question for the moment, but I'll present my question. It's about the translations for the work that the ESP is doing, because we know that the ESP is doing work for the whole world. And we have a lot of countries that don't use English as the official language. And even me and my colleague, when I was doing BSc, we had a lot of problem, a lot of difficult to use the ICRP documentation because a lot is still in English. I would like to know how so far ESP is thinking or is working with official translations of their documentation.
Maybe Chris should say something about that.
He's not here.
He's not here?
Can I give some indication? There is already for some ICRP document as a translation in the different languages. I think, for instance, Italians, we have the same problem because for us English is not so easy. And a group of Italian take care of the translation and so. And so we have on the web of ICRP already the translation in your language. So it's something a bit long, but it's working.
Maybe I could add something about TG109, about ethics in medicine. That was a subject that came several times to make sure that this English text, which is already difficult to read in English, will be readable in another language. And we had several discussions within the task group to try to make it as readable as possible. Hopefully we managed, but for sure having a translation in his or her own language is always easier. But I think Werner has something to say.
Just to emphasize what has already been said, ICRP produces in English language, and several countries then, once a report has been published, they start translating it into their own language, which is a big effort. And I know that from German, for example, when we try to translate English texts on that into German, it's not that easy to be precise and to grasp all the subtle differences between English words. So that's really difficult. I think ICRP cannot do that alone. Of course, we don't know all the languages. I gave a rather short example when we thought about this advice in case of nuclear detonations. So this was quickly, which is on our website, which was quickly translated now into 12 different languages by people from those countries who are, of course, familiar with radiological protection. So we need experts from every country to produce such kind of translations. ICRP cannot do that. It's impossible. But if you want to do that for your country, for example, you will get any support from ICRP needed. What we can do, we would do.
Could I just add to that? There is a process for this, and the scientific secretariat needs to know about these, because I'm Kimberly and chair of Committee 3 in Medicine. So we have several people that help us translate, and so we just ask that if you are going to be translating, or your Ministry of Health with you, that you contact the scientific secretariat through us or through somebody in ICRP, and then we log it and work with you through the scientific secretariat. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's Liz Ainsbury from the UK Health Security Agency and from Committee 1. I wanted to start by saying thank you very much to the presenters. You know, it's a really fascinating and, of course, incredibly important topic. I've got a slightly general question, but I wanted to ask while I've got you all sitting there. How do you think we can use this in the context of what's been discussed in previous sessions on the concept of the animal as a patient? You know, I think it's something that's kind of emerging, and you know, I know very little about this, but you know, I've sort of seen it discussed in the previous sessions. But I'm struggling to reconcile some of what's been said about ethics for humans with kind of how we treat animals, if you see what I mean. So, where's the overlap here? Thank you. I'm sorry.
I don't think for the population health ethics frameworks, they don't apply that easily to animal practice, other than perhaps with regards to the environment. And if you're looking at ecosystems and biodiversity, I think at the veterinary level, the original medical model, which deals with ethics to deal with managing individuals, would probably be the most applicable.
Can I answer?
Add a little point to that. I think it is very important that we look at such concepts, and that maybe the task groups that work on things, they invite specialists from, not from radiation protection, but from public health and from environmental health and from environmental ethics and whatnot. We have had in the Czech Republic now for the 5th time an international symposium on the ethics of environmental health, and there are always people from environmental epidemiology and people from toxicology and people from, I don't know, accident research and so on. And it's amazing what you can learn from this interaction. Maybe I'm wrong, but I sometimes think we are thinking too much in terms of radiation. As long as there's no gray to it, it's out of our scope, and it's not.
Can I provide an answer, Terry? Or go ahead.
Yeah, just to complete on this aspect, in the task group on reasonableness and tolerability, we are currently checking what has been done in a broader sense, mainly in the chemical risk, and notably ISO has developed some model on that. The current discussion is to move progressively from a quantitative approach to more broader, to develop some processes, deliberative process, and then the difficulty is that you have a series of components, and so you need to cope with that. How far we can embark all these elements in radiological protection and be sure that we will be practicable, because at the end it's good to have a series of considerations, but we need to provide some recommendations which will be useful and that you can apply in different type of exposure situation. So at this stage, we thought at the beginning that we were able to find a magic value, for example, for tolerability, but then you have some values which have been defined a long time ago without significant background. So is it, you may all have in mind the 10⁻⁶ annual risk from individual risk per annum, or 10⁻⁵ or something like that. But then what is the rationale behind that? How far, which element we embark in this calculation? How far is it comparable when we discuss in radiological protection with radiation health detriment, and we have some weighting factors. So what is the comparison that we can make with other risks? This is not so easy. We are currently doing an exercise to have benchmark with different risk of occupational risk or the risk of daily life. But then the comparison of risk is not the solution to find what is reasonable or tolerable, because we explain that we have so many aspects to be considered. We need to take into account the specific exposure situation. So there is mainly a proposal to have deliberative process, and when we check the situation in other domain, this is roughly what is proposed at this stage. But then one of the elements that on which we need to further work is all the concept of well-being, because we have seen with the last presentation that the well-being is a key element, and WHO clearly emphasizes on this topic. But then when we say well-being, this is good, but what is behind that, and what does it mean for radiological protection, for the day-to-day radiological protection, and for the selection of the option which will provide the good well-being in different situations. So this is some element where and in all this process, clearly ethical value will play a significant role.
Sorry to be awkward. I wanted to advertise my task group 110. Radiation protection and veterinary practice does have a section on that, on ethics and values. I agree with what the panelists were saying and how Francois introduced this idea of here's our core and procedural values, and then how specifically does this apply in our specific circumstance? So what additional interpretation do we have? So we took that very similar approach as task group 109 to say, like, okay, well, beneficence and non-maleficence, that could be animal welfare. So that's kind of how we've interpreted that, and we also tried to consider how that would be consistent with both people and the environment.
Thank you, Nicole. Any other questions or comments from the floor?
Time for coffee.
G'day, my name's Ivan Williams from Australia. My question's for Francois. So first of all, applause, thank you for putting together a draft document. I'm intrigued by the scenarios that you're putting together at the back of your document. When this goes for public consultation, will the committee reach out to international and national professional organisations for feedback on how they would view or review the scenarios which are being put forward?
Good question. Actually, we didn't ask international societies to make any censor on our scenarios, but we did present our draft report in many conferences, and we got some feedbacks. So that's how we proceeded. And maybe one of the most important feedback that we got was in 2019, just before the pandemic. We were taking part in a workshop organized by WHO, in which we had really a lot of different stakeholders that brought us some very nice feedbacks. And at the end, when the document was almost as it is now, we also had the opinion of a member of the International Patient Association, who read our document in order to make sure that, well, the examples that we have, that we propose are reasonable, and also that our document was readable, to answer a question that was just asked before. And he gave us also some very good feedbacks. So yes, we paid attention to have the opinion of the stakeholders, but we didn't explicitly send our document to a given set of societies. That is what will be done during the public consultation, actually.
Thank you. I would like to take the opportunity of having the floor to mention a couple of things. First of all, to let you know that WHO has published earlier this year a very short document. We call it a policy brief for healthcare providers, and it's on ethics and medical radiological imaging. It is also the topic of an e-poster that you can see outside during coffee break, and it's very relevant to the topic of this particular session. And the other thing is that I always told my kids every day is a special day. But today is also a very special day. It's November 8th, and it's the International Day of Radiology. So congratulations to all the radiologists here present. And with this, I would like you to join me in thanking the speakers of this morning's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.